Greetings, I'm Shad and welcome to part 2 in the truth about the falchion and messer. And specifically in this video, we'll be talking about what is the difference between the falchion and messer. Now, first of all, people generally, what I have found when you talk about the falchion or the messer, there's one specific kind of iconic image that everyone has for each of these swords. One for the falchion and one for the messer. And so when people say, oh, it's a falchion, they generally think of this sword, okay? And when they say the messer, they will either think of the one-handed version or the two-handed version, generally looking like this. Now, this is true, okay? This sword is a falchion and this sword is indeed a messer. But what I find a lot of people missing is that the falchion and messer, they're actually much more broad than just referring to one sword kind of design. In fact, they are very broad terms. Both the falchion and messer refer to many different styles and designs of swords. Now, of course, there are going to be distinct similarities between them all. For one, they will all be single-edged, okay? But in terms of blade profiles and designs, okay, all single-edged, but variance between blade profiles, there is a lot. There is actually a huge amount of differences. Once we understand this, and you look at all the different messer blade profiles and all the different falchion blade profiles, you will discover something very interesting. Most of the blade profiles on a falchion and a messer are identical to each other. Indeed, the falchion and messer only have a few blade profiles in each kind of category that are not more commonly found on the other, or not found at all. But it's only like a few. And if we will compare them in a rough visual representation of the overlap between falchion and messer blade profiles, we will see something like this, okay? Where most of the blade profiles are completely identical, and you will find them both on falchions and messers, and again, only a couple in each, category that would not be as commonly found on falchions or messers respectively. So then, if falchions and messers are so similar, what's the difference? What's even the point of having... Why are there two different swords? The answer is how the hilt is constructed specifically. This is actually the primary defining difference between a falchion and messer. It's the hilt. A falchion is constructed the classic way any other sword would be made, okay? So you have a blade which has a full tang that runs through the crossguard, through the handle, to the pommel, and it's usually either pinned or screwed on. That is how a sword's hilt is constructed, whereas on a messer is constructed the exact same way knives are constructed. So instead of having a thin tang that runs through the middle of the handle, it has a full tang. And so the tang is the exact same width as the handle itself. So it's not running through the handle, it's basically cutting the handle in half. And then each half of the handle can't be, just threaded onto the tang, okay? The handle has to be riveted on either side of the tang, just the way knives are made. And then you will either have an end cap or a pommel fixed to the bottom of the handle. And that is what defines a sword to be a messer, if it has this style of handle construction. The blades can be completely identical, and the way that you define one sword to be one or the other is, as I've explained, the hilt construction. What is significant about this is, remember how I said that there are certain blade profiles that you would more traditionally find on a falchion, and other blade profiles you would more traditionally find on a messer. Well, depending on how the handle is constructed, even though there's certain blade profiles that you would more largely associate with the other type of sword, if the handle is constructed a certain way, that's how you would define it. So you can have a blade that many people would think is more traditionally and universally found on a falchion, but if the handle is constructed like a knife, it's not a falchion, it's actually a messer, okay? And likewise, you can get a blade profile that is more traditionally found on messers, okay? And then if the handle construction is made the way a sword is made, it isn't a messer, it's a falchion. What this means is that these blade profiles that more traditionally sit outside of classic messer or falchion design can actually be included within these categories as a messer and a falchion, because it's not the blade profile that determines what the difference is, it's the handle construction.
And it's for this reason that James identifies the cleavers in the Massajalski Bible, or the Morgan Picture Bible, as proto-messers rather than falchions, because in close-up inspection of these swords, it shows that they depict a knife-like handle.
And this makes the crossover between these two types of swords even more so. Actually, it kind of closes the gap between the edges of this comparison that we have, where we have those blade profiles that you wouldn't usually find on either type of sword, or because they can be included depending on hilt construction, well, that makes these swords even more equivalent to one another than they were before. Indeed, we need to actually take a further step and acknowledge something about the falchion and the messer, and that is, objectively, these swords are functionally identical. And you might be thinking, oh, but the falchion can have a kind of broader blade, and the messer is, more curved and sometimes a bit longer. But remember, a falchion can have that type of blade, and the messer can have that type of blade. So again, these swords are actually identical, functionally identical, because these two different handle construction methods will have no significant impact on the sword's functionality at all. And there is no reason to define them differently from a functional standpoint. But from a historical standpoint, it's very important to know the difference, because these swords were developed in different times and in different locations under different circumstances. And you might be thinking, okay then, well, what were the ways these swords were developed to cause such a important distinction when we look at these swords in a historical context? Well, that is what I'll be covering in part 3. We are still looking at the differences, not the development. And because of that, I actually don't like that we have different names for these two types of swords, because it implies that they are two different types of swords, when we've just discovered that no, they're not. Now, I'm not saying that we get rid of the terms falchion and messer. What I'm saying is that we need to put them in the correct context. They are names for different designs of the same type of sword, the medieval single-edged sword. We just don't have a proper name for the medieval single-edged sword, apart from medieval single-edged sword, which is just too long and convoluted. Think about it. We have a name for the medieval one-handed sword. We have a name for the medieval two-handed sword. We have a name for the medieval really, really, really big two-handed sword, arming sword, longsword, and greatsword. But we don't have a name for the medieval single-edged sword.
And identifying all the different types of falchions and all the different types of messers in one unified group is something that James himself wants to do. And in his research, he has consistently used the term single-edged arms to refer to all types of falchions and all types of messers. For myself, I like to have a specific name for every type of sword, and when I look at the medieval single-edged sword, I don't see one. But to be very clear, the name that I feel works best for this category of swords is not one that Mr. Elmsley endorses. Which is absolutely understandable, because this is not an academic term. It's more a name that I personally feel works best in casual reference.
Now, what I am proposing actually isn't anything new. I am suggesting we follow the exact same methodology that already exists in the names and terms we have for swords. For instance, consider the greatsword. The greatsword has many different designs or profiles underneath the umbrella of greatsword. We have Zweihander, we have Montante, and we have Flamberg. Each of those terms I just mentioned are names for different designs of the same type of sword, the greatsword. And it's very effective, because when people say Zweihander or Montante, there's no confusion to think that they're different swords with, they would function differently and you have to use them differently, because no, they're both great swords. Well, this is the same with the messer and the falchion. They are both single-edged medieval swords. They are descriptive names for different designs, specifically different hilt construction methods of the same sword. Now, deciding on a simple descriptive name for the single-edged medieval sword, I found actually to be a bit more tricky than you might think. I wanted to follow the same methodology that we already have established. So something simple, a descriptive term, which would be something sword, because we have short sword, long sword, arming sword, great sword, side sword, back sword, short sword. Oh boy, I went through a lot of names, and I can't remember them all, but if you'll permit me, I'll read them to you. There was cut sword, slash sword, cleave sword, foot sword, arm sword, side sword, blade sword, sharp sword, common sword, low sword, best sword, pref sword, defense sword, escort sword, lead sword, guide sword, front sword, and blade sword. Oh, now I felt there needed to be some reference to what type of sword it was, and so after going through many different, terms, I have settled on, and what I propose to you is blade sword. Now that might seem dumb, some of you might think it's awesome and agree right off on the offset, but for those of you who think that's a bit of a dumb name, please let me explain. In regards to this type of sword, of which the Messer and Falchion are two different designs of, alright, it is on the blade where all the action is happening, and in several blade profiles, they have no thrusting capacity at all. They are all just full-on cut swords. It is the blade profile, and specifically the edge of those blades, what makes these swords what they are. Cut swords sounded a bit too dumb, and indeed there are profiles in which you can thrust effectively with these swords. But even though you can, there are designs that you can thrust effectively with these swords, it is in the cutting where the action is. These are all cut-focused slash hack swords. And so again, that's why I feel the most appropriate and best kind of sounding name for what this style of sword is blade sword. It is a blade sword. And I like it, again, because by calling it a blade sword, you are implying that there is more significance in the blade and edge of this style of sword than other styles of swords, which indeed is absolutely correct. I mean, especially when you look at the Type 1 blades. Type 1 blades? Yeah, that's the Elmsley typology. We'll get there. But just so we're on this right page, Type 1 is referring to, the more traditional kind of falchion blades. So the Conyers falchion blade design is what I'm kind of referring to when I say Type 1. And I mean, look at that. That's all blade right there. Blade sword.
I'll also mention another word that James actually thinks might be an appropriate name for this type of sword, and a bit more accurate than the one I've just proposed, and that is medieval backsword. Because the backswords are named backswords not for having a back, but because they have a single edge. It means the spine of the blade is square, giving it a back, hence sword with a back, or backsword. So falchions and messers are really the ancestors of the backsword. And because the backsword is a Renaissance period weapon, you could call the falchion and messer a medieval backsword to define the difference, in the sense that a falchion and messer don't have swept hilts, but they do share many blade profiles that are identical to the backsword.
There you go, guys. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, but we're not done yet. Please follow me over to part 3, the truth about the falchion and messer, where they come from and how they were developed. And until then, farewell!
If you would like to support Shadowversity, or express appreciation for a video that you particularly enjoyed, please become a patron through Patreon. Your $1 donation would be absolutely wonderful.